The air hung heavy with the scent of earth and roses as mourners gathered in St. Clement's Cemetery. A crowd of solemn faces encircled the freshly dug grave where the gleaming black headstone read, "Jonathan Morrow, a life of service and sacrifice." Among them, an elderly woman stood at the edge of the crowd, her presence quiet but undeniable. Her navy coat and matching hat framed her weathered face, and in her hands rested a single red rose. She had no small talk for the other mourners. Instead, her eyes stayed fixed on the polished casket. When the pastor concluded his prayer, the woman stepped forward. Her footsteps crunched softly against the gravel, and the crowd parted as if compelled by an unseen force. Reaching the casket, she placed the rose with deliberate care. Then she turned to face the gathered mourners. "My name is Eleanor Hayes," she began, her voice steady yet tinged with emotion. "I doubt many of you know me, but I knew Jonathan better than anyone here." A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd. Faces turned to one another, whispers passing between furrowed brows. Who was this woman to make such a bold claim? Eleanor stood tall, her gaze sweeping over the sea of faces, unwavering. "You may think you knew him," she said, her voice calm yet resolute. "But the man you came to honor today lived a life far more complex than the one you saw. Today, I will tell you the story of Jonathan Morrow, the man who changed my life and so many others." The air grew still, the murmurs fading into silence. Eleanor's words carried a weight that demanded attention, and as she drew a deep breath, she began her tale. "I met Jonathan 45 years ago in Selma, Alabama, during a time when people like me had no voice, no place, and no safety. Jonathan was a teacher back then, but his heart was in the civil rights movement. That's where we first crossed paths, on the steps of a church, where courage and defiance were all we had." The crowd leaned in, their curiosity piqued. What began as a routine farewell was transforming into a revelation. A story that would shake the foundations of everything they thought they knew about the man they came to mourn. The memories of their first encounter played vividly in Eleanor's mind as she spoke, her voice trembling slightly with both reverence and pain. "It was the spring of 1965, she began. "Selma was alive with the sound of footsteps, marchers filling the streets, voices lifted in songs of resistance. I was a young nurse then, working at a clinic for the poor, but my evenings were spent at community meetings, planning marches, sit-ins, and boycotts." Her gaze turned distant, as if the faces of those long-lost days stood before her again. Jonathan was new to town. He arrived quietly, blending in with the crowd, but it didn't take long for his presence to be felt. He wasn't just another idealist. He listened, truly listened. He didn't pretend to have all the answers. He simply showed up, again and again, ready to stand beside us. She paused, the weight of those days reflected in her eyes. "The first time we met, he had just been dismissed from a school for refusing to stop teaching Black history. The principal called it controversial. Jonathan called it the truth." The crowd shifted uneasily, their polished memories of the man already beginning to fracture. Eleanor pressed on, her voice steady. "That night, he came to the church where we were organizing a march. His shirt was torn, his hands blistered from hours of manual work he'd taken on to make ends meet. But he stood tall. When he spoke, his words carried a quiet strength. She looked at the crowd, her piercing gaze daring anyone to turn away. "No one is free until we all are," he said, "and I will stand with you, no matter the cost." Those weren't just words to him. Over the next few months I watched him put his body between peaceful protesters and armed officers. I saw him give his last dollar to buy food for children who had gone hungry for days. The crowd was utterly silent now, the weight of Eleanor's revelations drawing them closer. Jonathan wasn't just a teacher. He became our brother, our ally, and eventually my family. When the church was firebombed one night, he was the first to arrive, pulling people from the flames, his own face streaked with soot. That was Jonathan, A man who didn't hesitate, even when his own safety was at stake. Eleanor's voice softened, thick with emotion. But even as he stood with us, he carried a burden. His family disowned him for what they called his foolishness. He lost his home, his career, and his community, yet he never once turned back. The crowd stirred, their shock giving way to something deeper, an understanding that the man they mourned was far more than the polished philanthropist they had known. He didn't talk about those days, Eleanor said, her voice breaking slightly. He didn't want pity or applause. But I was there. I saw it all. And I'm here now to make sure you know the real Jonathan Morrow, the man who gave everything for justice and never asked for anything in return. Eleanor's voice faltered briefly as she glanced at the casket, her hand clutching the folded paper she had retrieved from her purse. Taking a deep breath, she continued. Jonathan never sought recognition for what he did. The man you knew, the philanthropist, the mentor, the friend, was a reflection of the life he lived, not the struggles he endured. But behind every act of kindness, there was a sacrifice he chose to bear alone. She looked out at the crowd, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. After he was fired, Jonathan lived in a rundown rooming house on the outskirts of Selma. It was small, barely enough to hold a bed and a desk, but he made it his base. From that room, he tutored children who had been turned away from segregated schools. He helped parents write letters to courts pleading for justice. He even hosted late-night strategy meetings, knowing full well that the wrong visitor could bring the police or worse to his door. The crowd stirred, their discomfort evident as Eleanor continued. One night, the threats became real. A brick was thrown through his window, followed by a note warning him to leave town, or else. But Jonathan refused. Fear is a weapon, he told me, and I won't give them mine. Eleanor paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. He paid a price for that courage. One night, after walking me home from a meeting, we were cornered by a group of men. They accused him of being a traitor, of choosing the wrong side. He was beaten that night, badly. They left him in an alley, thinking they'd silenced him. But the next morning he was back, standing on the church steps, his face bruised, but his spirit unbroken. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The Jonathan Morrow they knew had been a beacon of generosity and warmth. They had never imagined the depths of his resolve or the pain he had endured. That was the kind of man Jonathan was, Eleanor said, her voice firm now. He didn't let fear dictate his actions. He didn't let hate stop him from loving. And he didn't let pain diminish his purpose. She unfolded the paper in her hand, her fingers trembling slightly. He wrote this letter to me after that night. I want you to hear his words. Not just as a reminder of his strength, but as a testament to the choices he made. Her voice broke as she read aloud. Eleanor, I don't regret a single step of this journey. If standing with you means facing the worst of what people can do, so be it. I'd rather suffer for justice than live comfortably in the shadow of someone else's hate. Tears streamed down Eleanor's face, and she paused to compose herself. That was Jonathan, not the man in the tailored suit or the polished smile, but the man who fought for others even when it cost him everything. The crowd stood frozen, their grief now tinged with a profound sense of awe. They had come to mourn a philanthropist, but they were learning about a warrior, a man who gave everything so others could have a chance to live in dignity and freedom. The crowd stood in silence as Eleanor folded the letter, her hands trembling slightly. The weight of her words lingered in the air, the mourners now grappling with the revelation of Jonathan's sacrifices. But Eleanor wasn't finished. She took another steadying breath before continuing. Jonathan's courage didn't stop with the movement, she began, her voice softer now, laced with tenderness. There's another part of his story that none of you knew, a part he kept hidden, not because he was ashamed, but because the world wasn't ready to accept it. A ripple of curiosity moved through the crowd, the weight of her pause drawing them in. Eleanor's gaze softened as she looked toward the back of the gathering, where a man stood, his presence quiet but commanding. "His greatest love was his greatest secret," Eleanor said, her voice trembling. "Jonathan had a son." Gasps spread through the mourners, whispers quickly following. Eleanor let the noise settle before pressing on. "Samuel," she called gently, and the man stepped forward. He was tall, with broad shoulders and an air of quiet dignity. His resemblance to Jonathan was unmistakable, his jawline, the way he carried himself, even the fire in his eyes. "This is Samuel Morrow," Eleanor said, her voice steady, despite the emotion that thickened it. "Jonathan's son." The crowd shifted, some leaning forward in disbelief, others exchanging shocked glances. Samuel stepped beside Eleanor, his presence a living testament to the secret Jonathan had carried for decades. "Samuel's mother was a woman named Celeste," Eleanor continued. "She was a singer, brilliant, beautiful, and black. Jonathan loved her deeply, but in the world they lived in, their love was a danger. It could have cost them both everything." Her voice cracked, but she pressed on. "When Samuel was born, Jonathan was overjoyed, but he couldn't openly claim him. The risks were too great. His career, his safety, and even Samuel's future were on the line. But that didn't stop him from being a father." Eleanor looked at Samuel, her eyes brimming with pride. Jonathan did everything he could for his son. He paid for his schooling, visited him whenever he could under the cover of darkness, and wrote letters filled with love and guidance. Samuel's deep voice broke the silence. "He once told me," he began, his tone thick with emotion, "a father's love doesn't need an audience. It just needs to be constant." And he was, every single day. The crowd was visibly moved, many wiping tears from their eyes. The image of Jonathan Morrow, the man they thought they knew, was evolving before them, transforming into someone far more human, far more profound. "He loved quietly because he had to," Eleanor said, her voice firm. "But make no mistake, his love was fierce, and it shaped Samuel into the man you see before you today." Samuel looked out at the crowd, his gaze steady. "My father wasn't perfect," he said. "He made mistakes. But he taught me that love isn't about what the world allows, it's about what you choose, every single day." The mourners stood still, their silence now one of reverence. Jonathan's story was no longer just one of sacrifice, but also of love, a love so profound it endured even in the shadows, shaping a legacy no one could have imagined. Eleanor glanced at Samuel, his steady presence giving her the strength to continue. The crowd's attention was rapt, their faces reflecting a mix of awe and sorrow as they absorbed the revelations about Jonathan Morrow, the man they thought they knew. Jonathan's love for Samuel wasn't his only quiet sacrifice, Eleanor began. Her voice, though soft, carried the weight of unspoken truths. He gave himself fully to the causes he believed in, often at great personal cost, and though he never sought recognition, the choices he made left scars, both seen and unseen. She paused, her eyes distant as memories surfaced. In 1967, Jonathan was arrested for organizing a protest in Birmingham. He spent 3 months in a jail cell, enduring conditions none of us would wish on our worst enemies. When he was released, he was thinner, weaker, but his resolve was stronger than ever. The crowd shifted uneasily. The idea of Jonathan, the polished, composed man they had admired, enduring such hardship was almost too much to reconcile. But Eleanor pressed on. After his release, he moved to a tiny apartment in Montgomery. He didn't have much, a few books, a creaking bed, and a second-hand typewriter. He used that typewriter to draft letters to lawmakers, write essays for underground newspapers, and respond to anyone who reached out for help. He believed words could change the world, even when the world didn't seem to listen. Eleanor's voice softened, tinged with pride. He sent every spare dollar he had to support Samuel and Celeste. He even took on jobs he despised, shoveling coal, washing dishes, just to make sure they were cared for. And through it all, he never stopped fighting for others. Her gaze swept over the crowd. Many of you knew him as a philanthropist, a community leader, and a kind soul who always seemed to have time for everyone. But few of you knew the toll it took on him. He worked tirelessly, often at the expense of his own health, because he believed it was his duty to lift others up. Samuel stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. My father told me once, a life of service is a life of sacrifice, but the weight of that sacrifice is lighter when it's carried for others. He carried that weight every single day, even when it nearly broke him. Eleanor nodded, her eyes glistening. Jonathan didn't live for himself. He lived for the people who needed him most, even when it meant living in the shadows of his own potential. She paused, her voice catching in her throat. But he wasn't just a man of sacrifice. He was a man of courage. Courage to love, to fight, and to endure. The crowd's silence deepened, the reality of Jonathan's sacrifices sinking in. They had come to honor a philanthropist, but they now stood in the presence of a legacy built on quiet courage and unyielding love. Eleanor stood quietly for a moment, gathering her thoughts. The weight of Jonathan's story was palpable now, pressing heavily on the crowd that had come to pay their respects. When she spoke again, her voice carried a new resolve. Jonathan's sacrifices didn't end with his life, she said. In his final years, he planted seeds for a legacy that he knew he would never live to see bloom. The crowd leaned in, their curiosity piqued. Eleanor continued, 2 months before his passing, he called me. His voice was weak, but his determination hadn't faded. He told me about a trust he was creating, not for himself or his estate, but for the children of this community. He wanted to ensure they had opportunities he never had. The murmurs returned, rippling through the group. Eleanor raised a hand, silencing them. This trust wasn't just about money, it was about hope. Scholarships for underprivileged students, mentorship programs, and safe spaces for children to learn and grow. That's what Jonathan envisioned. Samuel stepped forward, his deep voice steady. That trust is real, he said, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. It's already been established, and its first recipients have been chosen. My father's dream was to create a world where every child, regardless of where they came from, had a chance to thrive. Eleanor nodded, her voice soft but firm. Jonathan believed that true change comes not from words alone, but from actions that ripple through generations. He wanted to leave behind more than memories. He wanted to leave behind a future. The crowd stood in stunned silence, the depth of Jonathan's vision sinking in. Some wiped tears from their eyes, others simply stared at the ground, lost in thought. He didn't care about recognition, Eleanor said, her tone resolute. He cared about impact. And even in his final days, when his body was failing him, his spirit remained unbroken. He spent every ounce of his strength ensuring that his life would mean something. Not just to those who knew him, but to the generations yet to come. Samuel's voice broke the silence. He told me once, legacy isn't about what you leave behind in stone. It's about what you leave behind in people. And standing here today, I see that legacy in every face before me. The crowd began to stir, their grief now mingled with a sense of awe and purpose. They had come to mourn a man they thought they knew, only to discover the depth of his humanity and the breadth of his vision. Eleanor stepped closer to the casket, her voice filled with quiet determination. Jonathan didn't just live a life of service. He lived a life of faith, in people, in justice, and in love. And he left us with a challenge, to carry that faith forward. The air was thick with emotion as Eleanor's words settled over the group. They had come to say goodbye, but they were leaving with something far greater, a responsibility to honor Jonathan's legacy by continuing the work he had begun. The sun hung low over the cemetery, casting golden light across the gravestones as Eleanor took a step closer to Jonathan's casket. The air was heavy with reflection, the crowd now quiet and somber, their hearts stirred by the truths revealed. She took a deep breath, her voice softer now, but no less powerful. There is one final story I want to share with you, a moment that truly defined Jonathan's life and the legacy he left behind. The crowd seemed to lean forward as Eleanor began. The year before he passed, Jonathan received a letter from a young boy named Marcus. The letter was simple, written in shaky handwriting. Marcus explained that his parents couldn't afford school supplies and that he didn't think he was smart enough to do anything important in life. Jonathan kept that letter on his desk, and when I asked him why, he said, "Because Marcus is every child who has ever doubted themselves. And he's the reason I do what I do." Eleanor paused, her gaze scanning the crowd. Jonathan didn't just write back. He visited Marcus's family, bringing them everything they needed. Not just supplies, but encouragement. He spent hours tutoring Marcus, telling him he was capable of greatness. And Marcus, that same boy who doubted himself, grew up to become a teacher who now mentors kids in the same neighborhood Jonathan once served. A murmur of astonishment rippled through the crowd. Eleanor smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. Jonathan didn't just touch lives, he transformed them. He planted seeds of hope, often in the most barren places, trusting they would one day bear fruit. She turned to Samuel, who stepped forward to stand beside her. His voice was calm but filled with emotion. "My father always believed that we are connected, that every act of kindness creates a ripple that reaches farther than we can imagine. He told me, the world may never know your name, but it will feel the impact of your love." Samuel looked out over the crowd, his expression solemn. "Today we're not just here to honor my father. We're here to take up his mantle. His life was a challenge to all of us, a challenge to live not for recognition, but for purpose, to serve others even when it's hard, to love even when it's risky." Eleanor's voice grew firm as she addressed the mourners one last time. Jonathan's legacy isn't the trust he left behind, though that will help many. It isn't even the lives he saved, though those are countless. His true legacy is the challenge he left us, to live with courage, compassion, and conviction. To be the kind of people who change the world, not for applause, but because it's the right thing to do. She stepped back, her hand resting gently on the casket. "So I ask you now, how will you honor him? How will you carry his legacy forward? Because Jonathan Morrow may be gone, but his work is far from finished." The crowd stood in silence, the weight of her words settling over them like a warm but heavy blanket. One by one, people began to step forward. Some laid flowers on the casket. Others whispered words of thanks. And still others simply stood, hands clasped, their faces etched with resolve. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the cemetery in a soft, golden glow, Eleanor and Samuel stood side by side watching the mourners slowly disperse. The space that had once been filled with grief now carried something new, hope, purpose, and a quiet determination to continue the work Jonathan had begun. In the fading light, Eleanor whispered, more to herself than anyone else, "He always said love wasn't just a feeling, it was a choice, and he chose it every single day." Samuel placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice low and steady. "And now it's our turn. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you won't miss any of our latest videos. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below. Thank you all for taking the time to watch, and see you in the next video.